The Black Cat. You are not going to believe this story, but it is a true story, as true as I sit here writing it, as true as I will die in the morning. Yes, this story ends with my end, with my death tomorrow. I have always been a kind and loving person. Everyone will tell you this. They will also tell you that I have always loved animals more than anything. When I was a little boy, my family always had many different animals round the house. As I grew up, I spent most of my time with them, giving them their food and cleaning them. I married when I was very young, and I was happy to find that my wife loved all of our animal friends as much as I did. She bought us the most beautiful animals. We had all sorts of birds, goldfish, a fine dog, and a cat. The cat was a very large and beautiful animal. He was black all over, and very intelligent. He was so intelligent that my wife often laughed about what some people believe. Some people believe that all black cats are evil, enemies in a cat's body. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite. It was always I who gave him his food, and he followed me everywhere. I often had to stop him from following me through the streets. For years, he and I lived happily together, the best of friends. But during those years, I was slowly changing. It was that evil enemy of man called drink who was changing me. I was not the kind, loving person people knew before. I grew more and more selfish. I was often suddenly angry about unimportant things. I began to use bad language, most of all with my wife. I even hit her sometimes. And by that time, of course, I was often doing horrible things to our animals. I hit all of them, but never Pluto. But my illness was getting worse. Oh yes, drink is an illness. Soon I began to hurt my dear Pluto too. I remember that night very well. I came home late, full of drink again. I could not understand why Pluto was not pleased to see me. The cat was staying away from me. My Pluto did not want to come near me. I caught him and picked him up, holding him strongly. He was afraid of me, and bit my hand. Suddenly, I was not myself any more. Someone else was in my body, someone evil and mad with drink. I took my knife from my pocket, held the poor animal by its neck, and cut out one of its eyes. The next morning, my mind was full of pain and horror when I woke up. I was deeply sorry. I could not understand how I could do such an evil thing. But drink soon helped me to forget. Slowly the cat got better. Soon he felt no more pain. There was now only an ugly, dry hole where the eye once was. He began to go round the house as usual again. He never came near me now, of course, and he ran away when I went too close. I knew he didn't love me any more. At first I was sad. Then slowly I started to feel angry. And I did another terrible thing. I had to do it. I could not stop myself. I did it with a terrible sadness in my heart, because I knew it was evil. And that was why I did it. Yes, I did it because I knew it was evil. What did I do? I caught the cat and hung him by his neck from a tree until he was dead. That night I woke up suddenly. My bed was on fire. I heard people outside shouting, "Fire! Fire!" Our house was burning. I, my wife, and our servant were lucky to escape. We stood and watched as the house burned down to the ground. There was nothing left of the building the next morning. All the walls fell down during the night, except one, a wall in the middle of the house. I realized why this wall did not burn, because there was new plaster on it. The plaster was still quite wet. I was surprised to see a crowd of people next to the wall. They were talking and seemed to be quite excited. I went closer and looked over their shoulders. I saw a black shape in the new white plaster. It was the shape of a large cat hanging by its neck. I looked at the shape with complete horror. Several minutes passed before I could think clearly again. I knew I had to try to think clearly. I had to know why it was there. I remembered hanging the cat in the garden of the house next door. During the fire, the garden was full of people. Probably someone cut the dead cat from the tree and threw it through the window to try and wake me. The falling walls pressed the animal's body into the fresh plaster. The cat burned completely, leaving the black shape in the new plaster. Yes, I was sure that was what happened. But I could not forget that black shape for months. I even saw it in my dreams. I began to feel sad about losing the animal, so I began to look for another one. I looked mostly in the poor parts of our town, where I went drinking. I searched for another black cat of the same size and type as Pluto. One night, as I sat in a dark and dirty drinking house, I noticed a black object on top of a cupboard near some bottles of wine. I was surprised when I saw it. I looked at those bottles a few minutes ago, I thought, and I am sure that object was not there before. I got up and went to see what it was. I put my hand up, touched it, and found that it was a black cat. A very large one, as large as Pluto. He looked like Pluto, too, in every way but one. Pluto did not have a white hair anywhere on his body. This cat had a large white shape on his front. He got up when I touched him, and pressed the side of his head against my hand several times. He liked me. This was the animal I was looking for. He continued to be very friendly, and later, when I left, he followed me into the street. He came all the way home with me. We now had another house, and came inside. He immediately jumped up onto the most comfortable chair and went to sleep. He stayed with us, of course. He loved both of us, and very soon he became my wife's favorite animal. But as the weeks passed, I began to dislike the animal more and more. I do not know why, but I hated the way he loved me. Soon I began to hate him. But I was never unkind to him. Yes, I was very careful about that. I kept away from him because I remembered what I did to my poor Pluto. I also hated the animal because he only had one eye. I noticed this the morning after he came home with me. Of course, this only made my dear wife love him more. But the more I hated the cat, the more he seemed to love me. He followed me everywhere, getting under my feet all the time. When I sat down, he always sat under my chair. Often he tried to jump up on my knees. I wanted to murder him when he did this. But I did not. I stopped myself because I remembered Pluto, but also because I was afraid of the animal. How can I explain this fear? It was not really a fear of something evil, but then how else can I possibly describe it? Slowly, this strange fear grew into horror. Yes, horror. If I tell you why, you will not believe me. You will think I am mad. Several times, my wife took the cat and showed me the white shape on his chest. She said the shape was slowly changing. For a long time I did not believe her, but slowly, after many weeks, I began to see that she was right. The shape was changing. Its sides were becoming straighter and straighter. It was beginning to look more and more like an object. After a few more weeks, I saw what the shape was. It was impossible not to see. There on his front was the shape of an object I am almost too afraid to name. It was that terrible machine of pain and death. Yes, the gallows. I no longer knew the meaning of happiness or rest. During the day, the animal never left me. At night, he woke me up nearly every hour. I remember waking from terrible dreams and feeling him sitting next to my face, his heavy body pressing down on my heart. I was now a very different man. There was not the smallest piece of good left in me. I now had only evil thoughts. The darkest and the most evil thoughts. I hated everyone and everything, my dear wife, too. One day she came down into the cellar with me to cut some wood. We were now too poor to have a servant. Of course, the cat followed me down the stairs and nearly made me fall. This made me so angry that I took the axe and tried to cut the animal in two. But as I brought the axe down, my wife stopped my arm with her hand. This made me even more angry, and I pulled her hand away from my wrist, lifted the tool again, brought it down hard, and buried it in the top of her head. I had to hide the body. I knew I could not take it out of the house. The neighbors noticed everything. I thought of cutting it into pieces and burning it. I thought of burying it in the floor of the cellar. I thought of throwing it into the river at the end of the garden. I thought of putting it into a wooden box and taking it out of the house that way. In the end, I decided to hide the body in one of the walls of the cellar. It was quite an old building near the river, so the walls of the cellar were quite wet and the plaster was soft. There was new plaster on one of the walls, and I knew that underneath it The wall was not very strong. I also knew that this wall was very thick. I could hide the body in the middle of it. It was not difficult. I took off some plaster, took out a few stones, and made a hole in the earth that filled the middle of the wall. I put my wife there, put back the stones, made some new plaster, and put it on the wall. Then I cleaned the floor and looked carefully round. Everything looked just as it did before. Nobody would ever know. Next, I went upstairs to kill the cat. The animal was bringing me bad luck. I had to kill it. I searched everywhere, but I could not find him. I was sure it was because of my wife's murder. He was too clever to come near me now. I waited all evening, but I did not see the evil animal. He did not come back during the night either. And so for the first time in a long time I slept well. When I woke up the next morning, I was surprised to see that the cat still was not there. 2, 3 days passed, and there was still no cat. I cannot tell you how happy I began to feel. I felt so much better without the cat. Yes, it was he who brought me all my unhappiness. And now, without him, I began to feel like a free man again. It was wonderful. No more cat. Never again. Several people came and asked about my wife, but I answered their questions easily. Then, on the 4th day, the police came. I was not worried when they searched the house. They asked me to come with them as they searched. They looked everywhere, several times. Then they went down into the cellar. I went down with them, of course. I was not a bit afraid. I walked calmly up and down, watching them search. They found nothing, of course, and soon they were ready to go. I was so happy that I could not stop talking as they went up the stairs. I did not really know what I was saying. "Good day to you all, dear sirs," I said. "Yes, this is a well-built old house, isn't it? Yes, a very well-built old house. These walls— Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are strong, aren't they?" I knocked hard on the part of the wall where my wife was. A voice came from inside the wall in answer to my knock. It was a cry, like a child's. Quickly it grew into a long scream of pain and horror. I saw the policemen standing on the stairs with their mouths open. Suddenly they all ran down in a great hurry and began breaking down the wall. It fell quickly, and there was my wife, standing inside. There she was, with dried blood all over her head, looking at them. And there was the cat, standing on her head, his red mouth wide open in a scream, and his one gold eye shining like fire. The clever animal. My wife was dead because of him, and now his evil voice was sending me to the gallows. The Ovel Portrait. We saw the dark shape of the roof above the forest. It was not far away, but travelling was difficult in that wild part of the mountains. We did not arrive until night was falling. It was a sad and strangely beautiful house, many hundreds of years old. Pedro, my servant, broke in through a small door at the back and carried me carefully inside. I was so badly hurt that I would die if we stayed out all night.
"People were living here until a very short time ago," Pedro said. "They left in a hurry."
He carried me through several tall, richly decorated rooms, to a smaller room in a corner of the great house. He helped me to lie down on the bed. There were a lot of very fine modern pictures in this room. I looked at them for a while in the dying light. They were everywhere on the walls, all round me. After dark, I could not sleep because of the pain. Also, I was so weak now that I was afraid that I was dying, so I asked Pedro to light the lamp beside the bed. I began to look at the pictures on the walls, and as I did so, I read a small book. I found this book on the bed next to me. It described all the pictures in the room, one by one, and told their stories. I looked and read for a long time, and the hours passed quickly. Midnight came and went. My eyes became more and more tired, and soon I found it hard to read the words on the page. So I reached out, this was painful and difficult, and moved the lamp closer. Now the lamp's light fell in a different part of the room, a part that was in deep shadow until then. I saw more pictures, and among them there was a portrait of a young woman. As soon as I saw it, I closed my eyes. Keeping my eyes closed, I tried to understand why. Why did I suddenly close my eyes like that? Then I realized I did it to give myself time. I needed time to think. Was I sure that I really saw what I thought I saw? Was I dreaming? No. I was suddenly very awake. I waited until I was calm again. Then I opened my eyes and looked a second time. No, there was no mistake. My eyes were seeing what they saw the first time only seconds before. The picture, as I said, was a portrait. It was oval in shape, and showed the head and shoulders of a young woman. It was the finest and the most beautiful painting that I have ever seen, and I know I never ever saw a woman as beautiful as her. But it was not her beauty that shook me so suddenly from my half-sleep, and it was not the beauty of the painter's work that excited me in such a strange way. I stayed for perhaps an hour, half sitting, half lying, never taking my eyes off the portrait. Then at last I understood. At last I realized what the true secret of the picture was, and I fell back in the bed again. It was the way she was looking at me. Her eyes, that beautiful smile, that way she looked at me, she was so real. It was almost impossible to believe that she was just paint, that she was not alive. The first time I looked at the portrait, I simply could not believe what my eyes were seeing. But now I felt a very different feeling growing inside me. The more I looked into those eyes, the more I looked at that beautiful smile, the more I was afraid. It was a strange, terrible fear that I could not understand. It was a fear mixed with horror. I moved the lamp back to where it was before. The portrait was now hidden in darkness again. Quickly, I looked through the book until I found the story of the Ovel Portrait. I read these words. She was a beautiful young flower, and always so happy. Yes, she was happy until that evil day when she saw and loved the painter of her portrait. They were married, but sadly, he already had a wife. His work, his painting was more important to him than anything in the world. Before, she was all light and smiles. She loved everything in the world. Now she loved all things but one, her husband's work. His painting was her only enemy, and she began to hate the paintings that kept her husband away from her. And so it was a terrible thing when he told her that he wanted to paint his young wife's portrait. For weeks she sat in the tall, dark room while he worked. He was a silent man, always working, always lost in his wild, secret dreams. She sat still, always smiling, never moving, while he painted her hour after hour, day after day. He did not see that she was growing weaker with every day. He never noticed that she was not healthy anymore, and not happy anymore. The change was happening in front of his eyes, but he did not see it. But she went on smiling. She never stopped smiling, because she saw that her husband, who was now very famous, enjoyed his work so much. He worked day and night, painting the portrait of the woman he loved. And as he painted, the woman who loved him grew slowly weaker and sadder. Several people saw the half-finished picture. They told the painter how wonderful it was, speaking softly as he worked. They said the portrait showed how much he loved his beautiful wife. Silently, she sat in front of her husband and his visitors, hearing and seeing nothing now. The work was coming near an end. He did not welcome visitors in the room any more. A terrible fire was burning inside him now. He was wild, almost mad with his work. His eyes almost never left the painting now, even to look at his wife's face. Her face was as white as snow. The painter did not see that the colors he was painting were no longer there in her real face. Many more weeks passed, until one day in the middle of winter, he finished the portrait. He touched the last paint onto her lips. He put the last thin line of color on an eye. Then he stood back and looked at the finished work. As he looked, he began to shake. All color left his face. With his eyes on the portrait, he cried out to the world, "This woman is not made of paint. She is alive!" Then he turned suddenly to look at the woman he loved so much. She was dead. Berenice. Aegeus is my name. My family, I will not name it, is one of the oldest in the land. We have lived here inside the walls of this great house for many hundreds of years. I sometimes walk through its silent rooms. Each one is richly decorated by the hands of only the finest workmen. But my favorite has always been the library. It is here among books that I have always spent most of my time. My mother died in the library. I was born here. Yes, the world heard my first cries here, and these walls, the books that stand along them, are among the first things I can remember in my life. I was born here in this room, but my life did not begin here. I know I lived another life before the one I am living now. I can remember another time, like a dream without shape or body, a world of eyes, sweet, sad sounds, and silent shadows. I woke up from that long night. My eyes opened, and I saw the light of day again, here, in this room full of thoughts and dreams. As a child, I spent my days reading in this library, and my young days dreaming here. The years passed. I grew up without noticing it, and soon I found that I was no longer young. I was already in the middle of my life, and I was still living here in the house of my fathers. I almost never left the house, and I left the library less and less. And so slowly, the real world, life in the world outside these walls, began to seem like a dream to me. The wild ideas, the dreams inside my head were my real world. They were my whole life. Berenice and I were cousins. She and I grew up together here in this house, but we grew so differently. I was the weak one, so often sick, always lost in my dark and heavy thoughts. She was the strong, healthy one, always so full of life, always shining like a bright new sun. She ran over the hills under the great blue sky, while I studied in the library. I lived inside the walls of my mind, fighting with the most difficult and painful ideas. She walked quickly and happily through life, never thinking of the shadows around her. I watched our young years flying away on the silent wings of time. Berenice never thought of tomorrow. She lived only for the day. Berenice. I call out her name, Berenice, and 1,000 sweet voices answer me from the past. I can see her clearly now, as she was in her early days of beauty and light. I see her, and then suddenly all is darkness, mystery and fear. Her bright young days ended when an illness, a terrible illness, came down on her like a sudden storm. I watched the dark cloud pass over her. I saw it change her body and mind completely. The cloud came and went, leaving someone I did not know. Who was this sad person I saw now? Where was my Berenice, the Berenice I once knew? This first illness caused several other illnesses to follow. One of these was a very unusual type of epilepsy. This epilepsy always came suddenly, without warning. Suddenly her mind stopped working. She fell to the ground, red in the face, shaking all over, making strange sounds, her eyes not seeing any more. The epilepsy often ended with her going into a kind of very deep sleep. Sometimes this sleep was so deep that it was difficult to tell if she was dead or not. Often she woke up from the sleep as suddenly as the epilepsy began. She would just get up again as if nothing was wrong. It was during this time that my illness began to get worse. I felt it growing stronger day by day. I knew I could do nothing to stop it. And soon, like Berenice, my illness changed my life completely. It was not my body that was sick. It was my mind. It was an illness of the mind. I can only describe it as a type of monomania. I often lost myself for hours, deep in thought about something so unimportant that it seemed funny afterwards. But I am afraid it may be impossible to describe how fully I could lose myself in the useless study of even the simplest or most ordinary object. I could sit for hours looking at one letter of a word on a page. I could stay for most of a summer's day watching a shadow on the floor. I could sit without taking my eyes off a wood fire in winter until it burnt away to nothing. I could sit for a whole night dreaming about the sweet smell of a flower. I often repeated a single word again and again for hours until the sound of it had no more meaning for me. When I did these things, I always lost all idea of myself, all idea of time, of movement, even of being alive. There must be no mistake. You must understand that this monomania was not a kind of dreaming. Dreaming is completely different. The dreamer, I am talking about the dreamer who is awake, not asleep, needs and uses the mind to build his dream. Also, the dreamer nearly always forgets the thought or idea or object that began his dream. But with me, the object that began the journey into deepest thought always stayed in my mind. The object was always there at the center of my thinking. It was the center of everything. It was both the subject and the object of my thoughts. My thoughts always came back to that object in a never-ending circle. The object was no longer real, but still I could not pull myself away from it. I never loved Berenice, even during the brightest days of her beauty. This is because I have never had feelings of the heart. My loves have always been in the world of the mind. In the grey light of early morning, among the dancing shadows of the forest, in the silence of my library at night, Berenice moved quickly and lightly before my eyes. I never saw my Berenice as a living Berenice. For me, Berenice was a Berenice in a dream. She was not a person of this world. No, I never thought of her as someone real. Berenice was the idea of Berenice. She was something to think about, not someone to love. And so why did I feel differently after her illness? Why, when she was so terribly and sadly changed, did I shake and go white when she came near me? Because I saw the terrible waste of that sweet and loving person. Because now there was nothing left of the Berenice I once knew. It is true, I never loved her, but I knew she always loved me, deeply. And so one day, because I felt so sorry for her, I had a stupid and evil idea. I asked her to marry me. Our wedding day was growing closer, and one warm afternoon I was sitting in the library. The clouds were low and dark, the air was heavy, everything was quiet. Suddenly lifting my eyes from my book, I saw Berenice standing in front of me. She was like a stranger to me, only a weak shadow of the woman I remembered. I could not even remember how she was before. God, she was so thin. I could see her arms and legs through the grey clothes that hung round her wasted body. She said nothing, and I could not speak. I do not know why, but suddenly I felt a terrible fear pressing down like a great stone on my heart. I sat there in my chair, too afraid to move. Her long hair fell around her face. She was as white as snow. She looked strangely calm and happy, but there was no life at all in her eyes. They did not even seem to see me. I watched as her thin, bloodless lips slowly opened. They made a strange smile that I could not understand. And it was then that I saw the teeth. Oh, why did she have to smile at me? Why did I have to see those teeth? I heard a door closing and I looked up. Berenice was not there any more. The room was empty. But her teeth did not leave the room of my mind. I now saw them more clearly than when she was standing in front of me. Every smallest part of each tooth was burnt into my mind. The teeth. There they were in front of my eyes, here, there, everywhere I looked, and they were so white, with her bloodless lips always moving round them. I tried to fight this sudden, terrible monomania, but it was useless. All I could think about, all I could see in my mind's eye was the teeth. They were now the center of my life. I held them up in my mind's eye, looked at them in every light, turned them every way. I studied their shapes, their differences, and the more I thought about them, the more I began to want them. Yes, I wanted them. I had to have the teeth. Only the teeth could bring me happiness, could stop me from going mad. Evening came. Then darkness turned into another day. Soon a second night was falling, and I sat there alone, never moving. I was still lost in thought, in that one same thought. The teeth. I saw them everywhere I looked, in the evening shadows, in the darkness in front of my eyes. Then a terrible cry of horror woke me from my dreams. I heard voices and more cries of sadness and pain. I got up and opened the door of the library. A servant girl was standing outside, crying. "Your cousin, sir," she began. "It was her epilepsy, sir. She died this morning." This morning? I looked out of the window. Night was falling. "We are ready to bury her now," said the girl. I found myself waking up alone in the library again. I thought that I could remember unpleasant and excited dreams, but I did not know what they were. It was midnight. They buried Berenice soon after dark, I told myself again and again, but I could only half remember the hours since then. Hours full of a terrible, unknown horror. I knew something happened during the night, but I could not remember what it was. Those hours of the night were like a page of strange writing that I could not understand. Next, I heard the high, cutting scream of a woman. I remember thinking, what did I do? I asked myself this question out loud, and the walls of the library answered me in a soft voice like mine. What did you do? There was a lamp on the table near me, with a small box next to it. I knew this box well. It belonged to our family's doctor. But why was it there now on the table? And why was I shaking like a leaf as I looked at it? Why was my hair standing on my head? There was a knock on the door. A servant came in. He was wild with fear and spoke to me quickly in a low, shaking voice. I could not understand all of what he was saying.
"Some of us heard a wild cry during the night, sir," he said. "We went to find out what it was, and we found Berenice's body lying in the open, sir," he cried. "Someone took her out of the hole where we buried her. Her body was cut and bleeding. But worse than that, she was not dead, sir. She was still alive."
He pointed at my clothes. There was blood all over them. I said nothing. He took my hand. I saw cuts and dried blood on it. I cried out, jumped to the table and tried to open the box. I tried and tried, but I could not. It fell to the floor and broke. Dentist's tools fell out of it, and with them, so small and so white, 32 teeth fell here, there, everywhere. The Mask of the Red Death. For a long time, the Red Death was everywhere in the land. There never was a plague that killed as many, and there never was a death as terrible. First, you felt burning pains in your stomach. Then everything began to turn round and round inside your head. Then blood began to come out through your skin. Yes, you began to bleed all over your body, but most of all through your face. And of course, when people saw this, they left you immediately. Nobody wanted to help you. Your horrible red face told everyone that it was too late. Yes, the Red Death was a very short illness, only about half an hour from its beginning to your end. But Prince Prospero was a brave and happy and wise prince. When half of the people in his land were dead, he chose 1,000 healthy and happy friends and took them away from the city. He took them over the hills and far away to his favorite house in the middle of a forest. It was a very large and beautiful house with a high, strong wall all round it. The wall had only one door, a very strong metal one. When the prince and all his friends were safely inside, several servants pushed the great door shut. Looking pleased with himself, the prince locked it, and threw the key, it was the only one, over the wall into the lake outside. He smiled as he watched the circles in the deep, dark water. Now nobody could come in or out of the house. Inside there was plenty of food, enough for more than a year. He and his lucky friends did not have to worry about the Red Death outside. The outside world could worry about itself. And so everyone soon forgot the terrible plague. They were safe inside the prince's beautiful house, and they had everything they needed to have a good time. There were dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All this and more was inside. The Red Death was outside. 5 months later, the plague was still everywhere in the land. Prince Prospero gave a very special party for his 1,000 friends. It was a masked party of a most unusual kind. Prince Prospero gave this party in the newest part of his great house, in 7 rooms which he almost never used. Normally, only the most important visitors used those rooms, foreign princes, for example. They were very unusual, those 7 rooms, and that is why he chose them for the party. Prince Prospero often had very unusual ideas. He was a very unusual, a very strange person. First of all, the rooms were not in a straight line. Walking through them, you came to a turn every 20 or 30 yards, so you could only ever see into one other room at a time. Yes, it was a strange part of the house, and in every room the furniture was different. With each turn you always saw something interesting and new. In every room there were 2 tall and narrow windows, one on either side. There was coloured glass in these windows, a different colour in each room. This, and everything else, of course, was the prince's idea. I forgot to tell you, the prince made the plans for this part of the house himself. Of course, it was the prince who decorated the rooms for the party, and he did this in his usual, unusual way. Like the glass, each room was a different colour, and everything in each room was that same colour. The first room at the east end was blue, and so were the windows, bright blue. In the second room, everything was purple, like the glass. In the third, everything was green. The fourth was orange, the fifth white, the sixth yellow. In the 7th room, everything was black. Everything but the windows. They were a deep, rich red colour, the colour of blood. There were no lamps anywhere in the 7 rooms. Light came from the windows on either side. Outside each window there was a fire burning in a large metal dish. These fires filled the rooms with bright, rich, and strangely beautiful colours. But in the west room, the black room, the blood-coloured light was horrible. It gave a terrible, wild look to the faces of those who went in. Few people were brave enough to put 1 foot inside. A very large clock stood against the far wall of the black room. The great machine made a low, heavy clang, clang, clang sound. Once every hour, when the minute hand came up to 12, it made a sound that was so loud, so deep, so clear, and so richly, so strangely musical, that the musicians stopped playing to listen to it. All the dancers stopped dancing. The whole party stopped. Everybody listened to the sound. And as they listened, some people's faces became white. Other people's heads began to go round and round. Others put hands to their heads, surprised by sudden, strange, dream-like thoughts. And when the sound died away, there was a strange silence. Light laughs began to break the silence. People laughed quietly, quickly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled. They promised that when the next hour came, they would not be so stupid. They would not stop and listen like that. They would go on playing without listening at all. But then, 3,600 seconds later, the clock made the same sound again. And again. Everything stopped. Again the people's faces became white. Again those strange, dream-like thoughts went through people's minds. And again there was that same empty silence, those same quiet laughs, and those same smiles and promises. But if we forget this, it was a wonderful party. Yes, we can say that the prince had a truly fine eye for colour, and all his friends enjoyed his strange decorations. Some people thought he was mad, of course. Only friends who knew him well knew he was not. But he did more than choose the decorations. He also chose the way everyone was dressed. Oh, yes, you can be sure that they were dressed strangely. And many of them were much more than just strange. Yes, there was a bit of everything at that party, the beautiful, the ugly, and a lot of the horrible. They looked like a madman's dreams, those strange masked people dancing to the wild music. They went up and down, changing colour as they danced from room to room, until the minute hand on the clock came up to the hour. And then, when they heard the first sound of the clock, everything stopped as before. The dreams stood still until the great deep voice of the clock died away. Then there was that same strange silence. Then there were those little light and quiet laughs. Then the music began again. The dreams began to move once more, dancing more happily than ever. They danced and danced, on and on, through all the rooms except one. No one went into the west room any more. The blood-coloured light was growing brighter and more horrible with every minute. But in other rooms the party was going stronger than ever. The wild dancing went on and on until the minute hand reached that hour again. Then, of course, when the first sound of the clock was heard, the music stopped, the dancers became still. All was still. It was midnight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 12 times the clock made that same strange, deep, and so sweetly musical sound. Midnight. 7, 8. It seemed like there was no end to the sounds this time. Each sound seemed to go on forever. And as those 12 sounds went on and on and on, people became whiter. Their heads began to go round and round and round. They thought stranger and more dreamlike thoughts than ever before. And some of them saw a tall, masked man walking slowly and silently among them. The news travelled quickly through the rooms. Soon everybody at the party was talking about the tall, masked man. As the stranger walked silently among them, people looked at him with anger and horror. Anger at choosing those clothes. Horror at choosing that mask. If it was to make them laugh, then it was not funny. Even the prince would never dream of wearing those clothes. The stranger was wearing black clothes. His mask was the face of a dead man. Yes, it was a death mask, but it was the colour of that mask that made everyone shake with horror. The mask was red. It was the mask of the Red Death. Prince Prospero saw the stranger as he walked among the dancers, and suddenly he became mad with anger. He waved his hand, and the music stopped immediately. "Who?" he shouted. "Who has done this horrible thing? Catch that man! Take off that mask! We will cut off his head in the morning." The masked stranger began walking slowly towards the prince as he said this. Everybody, even the brave Prince Prospero, was suddenly afraid. Nobody was brave enough to put out a hand to stop the visitor. He passed very close to the prince, and everybody everywhere stepped back against the walls as he walked slowly out of the blue room and into the purple, through the green, into the orange, into the white, into the yellow. Suddenly, Prince Prospero was angry with himself for being so stupidly afraid. He ran after the stranger. He ran through the 6 rooms, but nobody followed him. Pulling out his knife, he ran into the black room. The masked man, who was walking towards the opposite corner, stopped. The prince stopped a yard from him. The masked man turned suddenly, and a terrible, cutting cry was heard. The prince's shining knife fell without a sound on the black floor. The prince fell without a sound next to it. Dead. Suddenly, and nobody knew why, suddenly the dancers were no longer afraid. A crowd of them ran into the black room. They ran to the stranger who was standing in the shadow of the great clock. When they caught him, the mask and the empty clothes fell to the floor. Everyone cried out in horror. There was nobody inside the clothes. There was nobody there. The man's body was nothing but air. Everyone understood that the Red Death was now among them. He came like a thief in the night, and as the seconds passed, clang, 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 one by one, people began to die the terrible death. Soon, everywhere, the floors of the 7 rooms were wet with blood. When the last person died, the last lamp went out. And when that last lamp went out, the life of the clock stopped with it. And everything was silence and darkness.
The Fall of the House of Usher. It was late autumn. The weather was wet and the wind had blown all the leaves from the trees. I was riding my horse across the wet, empty land. I was traveling alone. I was going toward a dark and strange house, the House of Usher. Why had I come to this lonely place? I knew Roderick Usher, the owner of the house. We were old friends, but we had not met for many years. A few weeks ago, I had received a letter from Roderick. "I am ill, very ill. Please come and visit me. I am going mad. I want your help. We have been friends since we were boys. Please come. Roderick Usher." I had been riding all day, and it was now late. The pale sun was low in the sky when I arrived at the house of Usher. A large lake of black water surrounded the house. I stopped by the lake and looked at the house. Roderick Usher's house was a large black building. Its many windows were like empty eyes. Suddenly, I felt cold and a little afraid. In front of me, a narrow road went across a bridge toward the house. I walked my horse along the narrow road until I reached the walls of the house. I knocked on the front door, and a servant opened it. He took my horse to a stable. Then he led me inside the house. We climbed many stairs to his master's room. Lamps burned along the walls, but they gave little light. The long corridors and stairways were full of dark shadows. The servant opened a big wooden door, and I looked inside a large room. At first, I did not recognize the man who was lying on a sofa. Then I saw that it was Roderick Usher. My friend had changed. He looked pale and ill. We were the same age, but he looked much older than me. His hair was silver gray and as soft as the web of a spider. I thought that Roderick was asleep because his eyes were closed. But as I entered the room, he sat up. Then he opened his eyes. They shone strangely in the weak light from the lamps. I walked toward him. "Welcome, my oldest and dearest friend," he said. But he did not shake my hand or come near me. "Please excuse me," he said. "I don't wish to be rude, but I'm ill. I can't touch another man's hand. Please sit down. Rest a moment. A servant will take you to your room very soon. Then we shall have dinner and talk. I'm glad that you have come," he went on. "I have no one to talk to. My sister lives with me, but she is sick." At that moment, a woman walked into the room. She was very pale and her eyes shone strangely. She wore a black dress with a high collar. The collar covered her long neck. She did not look toward me, and she did not speak. Roderick Usher spoke to her. "Madeline," he said. "Madeline, this is my old friend." Madeline did not reply. She crossed the room slowly. Then she turned and went through a doorway. Madeline left the room as silently as she had entered it. Roderick Usher put his hands over his face. "My sister has a strange illness. She is neither awake nor asleep. I fear that she'll not live long." He rang a bell, and a servant took me to my room. I lay on the bed and rested for an hour before dinner. I thought about Roderick and his sister. They were both behaving strangely. I did not feel comfortable in the house, but I could not leave immediately. I felt more comfortable at dinner. Roderick asked me about my life. He looked happier. I forgot about his sister and the strange old house. Roderick Usher looked after me well for several days. We ate and drank and talked. We read books in the library. I painted pictures. Roderick played the guitar. I did not see Madeline again, and I did not ask about her. Roderick had been alone for too long. He talked about happier days. We talked about the time when we were boys, but sometimes Roderick suddenly stopped talking. He stared in front of him. Then he turned his head to the left, then to the right. Was he listening to something? There was a look of sadness and fear on his face. I, too, felt afraid at these times. I did not like this house of Usher, but I had come a long way to visit Roderick. I could not leave my friend. He wanted me to stay with him. As the days passed, Roderick became more quiet and sad. One evening, he suddenly came into my room. "Madeline is dead," he said. I was shocked. I did not know what to say. I did not know what to do. "I need your help," said Roderick Usher. "Madeline had been very ill. She was going to die. I knew this. But she mustn't be buried near a church. She'll lie in this house. I'll keep her body in a room under the house. Will you help me?" My friend's words frightened me, but I did not ask any questions. I do not know why. We carried Madeline's body down many steps to a room under the house. No one had been in the room for many years. There were soft gray spiders' webs hanging from the ceiling. The air was cold and damp. There were several lamps burning on the walls, but they gave little light. A wooden coffin was in the center of the room. I helped Roderick to put his sister's body in the coffin. She wore a white dress. Her face was as white as her dress. Roderick looked at his sister for a long time. "Madeline will rest here," he said sadly. His face was pale, and I saw the bones of his skull beneath the skin. He had not eaten for several days. Madeline was not breathing, and her heart was not beating. But Madeline's body was not cold. Then I knew, and I was afraid. She was dead, but she was not dead. Roderick fastened the lid on the coffin. Then he led me out of the room. "No one will ever come here again," he said. "Madeline is resting now. No one will wake her." But from that moment, Roderick Usher never rested. He did not sleep. How long can a man live without sleep? He walked from room to room. He stared in front of him. He turned his head to the left, then to the right. Was he listening to something? Was Roderick Usher mad? I too could not sleep. I lay on my bed and thought about the strange house of Usher. Suddenly, my bedroom door opened and Roderick came into the room. He was holding a lamp. His eyes were bright and wild. "Did you hear it?" he said. "Did you see it?" "Hear what?" I asked. "See what?" "You will understand soon," he said. He pulled back the curtains and opened the window. It was dark outside and there was a storm. The wind was blowing and rain was falling. Then a flash of lightning lit the sky. A few seconds later, there was a crash of thunder. The wind blew into the room. It screamed as it blew around the room. The door crashed shut, and the flame in the lamp went out. Suddenly, there was a loud noise and the floor of the room moved. "I can hear the softest sounds," Roderick said. "I can hear everything. I can hear her." "Who can you hear?" I asked loudly. I covered my face because the wind was blowing into my eyes. "Madeline!" Roderick replied. "I can hear her. She's coming here. She has opened her coffin. She's coming up the stairs. She's coming for me." The strong wind blew around the room again. It blew the door of the room open. Outside, lightning flashed again and again. Suddenly, I saw Madeline Usher. She was standing in the doorway. She was wearing the white dress, but it was no longer white. Her dress was covered in blood. Madeline had broken out of her coffin. She had torn her hands and her face. There was blood on her fingers, her face, and her dress. Madeline's eyes were open, but she saw nothing. She stared in front of her. She held her hands out toward her brother. Slowly, Roderick went toward her, and she closed her blood-red arms around his body. Roderick gave a terrible scream and fell to the floor. Madeline fell with him. Their bodies lay on the floor and they did not move. They were both dead. I ran from the terrible house of Usher. I ran across the narrow bridge. When I reached the other side of the lake, I turned around. I looked back at the house. The wind was still blowing around the house. It made the sound of a wild animal. And I could see the wind. It was black and terrible. Lightning flashed in the sky, and thunder crashed. Then a bright flash of lightning hit the house and the walls broke. Slowly, the house started to fall. With a great roar, the house fell into the lake. Then the water of the lake covered the house of Usher, and there was silence.
Ligeia by Edgar Allan Poe. Chapter 1. A Beautiful Wife. I cannot remember how, when, or where I met Ligeia. It was a long time ago, and my memory is not good. But I think I met her first in a large old city near the Rhine in Germany. She told me that she came from an ancient family. But I never knew the family name of the woman who was my friend, my partner in my studies, and finally my wife. Why did I never discover her family name? Perhaps because she did not want me to find out. But I cannot remember. I remember one thing very well. Ligeia was tall and slim. Later, at the end, she became very thin. How can I describe her quiet, aristocratic movements or the strange softness of her footsteps? If she came into my office, I only knew she was there when I heard her voice, or when she put her white hand on my shoulder. She had a beautiful face, but it was not a classical kind of beauty. There was something strange about it. I have often tried to understand it. Was it her pure white skin or her thick black hair? I looked at her long, delicate nose many times. It was perfect. I looked at her sweet mouth. How soft and red it was. And when she smiled, her teeth were white. Then I looked into her eyes. They were much bigger than normal eyes. Sometimes, when she was excited, they looked like a deer's eyes. They were black with long black eyelashes and black eyebrows. But as I looked into them, I realized that they had a strange expression. I thought about it for many hours, sometimes all night. What was the expression in those eyes? I wanted to know. Many times I thought I almost had the answer, but then it was gone. Ligeia was very determined. She was always calm and quiet, but her determination showed in her eyes. It shone like a terrible energy, and sometimes it frightened me. Ligeia was very clever. She was excellent at Latin and Greek, and she knew many other languages perfectly. She never made a mistake. She was also a student of science and mathematics. When we were first married, I often asked her for help with my studies, and we worked together. But after she died, I was alone. Without her, I was like a child in the dark. When she first became ill, she did not come to help me as often as before. She lost weight, and her skin became pale and transparent. When I saw that she was dying, I felt desperate. Ligeia resisted death with all her energy. She was determined to live. I watched in agony as she fought for life. I knew she loved me, but I only understood how much she loved me now that she was dying. She held my hands and said that she was devoted to me. I cannot talk about it now, but let me say that her love for me was part of her determination to live. On the night she died, she suddenly got out of bed and cried, "Oh God, must I die? Must I lose my fight with death? No, I can't die like this." But my dear Ligeia died. I was so sad I could not stay in the old city by the Rhine. For a few months I travelled around. Then I bought an old abbey in an isolated part of England. This dark, sad place expressed my feelings of loneliness. But I decorated it with beautifully coloured curtains, carpets, and ornaments. I said to myself, perhaps the bright colours will make me feel happier. Unfortunately, they did not. I began to drink too much. But I do not want to speak about that time of my life. I will only say that one day I married Lady Rowena Trevanion of Tremaine. My new wife had blonde hair and blue eyes. She was very different from my first wife. But how could I ever forget Ligeia? Chapter 2. A Fight with Death. I took Lady Rowena back to a room high up in the tower of the abbey, where we lived for the first month of our marriage. The room was very large, with an enormous window made of glass from Venice. The ceiling was high, like a church, and in the centre there was a big gold chandelier. There were sofas from the east and an Indian bed. On the walls were long tapestries, like carpets, with designs made of gold. The tapestries moved every time the wind blew. My wife was afraid of me because I was often sad and depressed. She did not love me much and stayed away from me, but I preferred this. I always thought about Ligeia, my beautiful Ligeia, dead in the tomb. Sometimes in my dreams I called to her in the night. I imagined that perhaps my love for her could bring her back to me. At the beginning of the second month, Lady Rowena became ill. She did not sleep very well, and told me she could hear sounds and movements in the tower. "You have a fever," I said. "You're imagining things." She got better, but then she went back to bed with a second illness, worse than the first. The doctors could not understand it. Again, Rowena began to hear little sounds and movements in the bedroom, and they frightened her. One night, at the end of September, she woke up suddenly. I was sitting on a sofa by her bed. She whispered to me that she could hear sounds and see movements, and there was a frightened expression on her thin face. But I saw and heard nothing. "It's the wind," I explained. "You can see the tapestries moving in the wind." But her face was white with fear, and she nearly fainted. I remembered that there was some wine on the table on the other side of the room. As I walked under the light of the chandelier, a strange thing happened. I felt something invisible pass me, and on the carpet I saw a shadow, almost the shadow of a shadow. I decided to say nothing to Rowena. I poured out a glass of wine and gave it to her. Then I sat on the sofa and watched her. After some moments, I heard very quiet footsteps on the carpet coming towards the bed. A second later, as Rowena was about to drink the wine, I saw, or perhaps I dreamed that I saw, 3 or 4 large drops of a bright red liquid fall into the glass. Rowena did not see it. She drank the wine, and I said nothing because I thought it was only my imagination. After this, Rowena's health got much worse, and on the 3rd night she died. Her servants prepared her for the tomb, then covered her with a sheet. The next night, I sat alone with her body in the bedroom. Strange forms and shadows moved around me. I looked nervously into the dark corners at the moving tapestries, and I felt frightened. Then I looked at the carpet under the chandelier. There was no shadow there, and I felt better. When I looked at Rowena on the bed, sad memories of Ligeia, the only woman I ever loved, came back to me. It was perhaps around midnight when I heard a sound. It was quiet but clear, and it woke me from my dreams. I thought it came from the bed. I listened in terror, but I did not hear it again. I looked carefully at Rowena for any sign of life. She was not moving, but I continued to look at her. Minutes passed. Then I noticed a little colour in Rowena's face. My heart stopped in horror. I could not move. When I understood that Rowena was not dead, I tried to revive her. But soon the colour disappeared from her cheeks. Her face looked like marble again, and her lips were thin with the horrible expression of death. When her body was cold and rigid, I fell onto the sofa and dreamed about Ligeia. An hour later, I heard the same sound as before. I listened. Yes, there it was again, a sigh from the bed. I ran over and saw clearly that her lips were trembling. Then they opened, showing her bright teeth. I thought I was going mad. There was a pink colour on her cheeks and neck. Her body was getting warm again, and her heart was beating a little. Lady Rowena was alive. I did everything I could to revive her. Then, suddenly, her colour disappeared. Her heart stopped, and her body became cold and rigid. I sat down and began to think about Ligeia again. Then again, for the 3rd time, there was a sound from the bed. But why must I describe the horrors of that night? Again, I tried to revive Rowena, and then a 4th time. Each time, she seemed to fight with an invisible force. And each time, her body changed. I cannot say how, but she looked different. It was nearly dawn when she moved again. I was sitting on the sofa, exhausted, but Rowena's body moved with more energy than before. Her colour returned, signs of life changed her face. Her eyes were closed, but she looked alive. Then she suddenly got out of bed and walked slowly to the centre of the room, like she was walking in her sleep. I did not tremble. I did not move. I was as cold and still as stone, paralysed by what I saw. As I looked at her, my head filled with wild thoughts. Was Rowena really alive? Could I really see her blonde hair and blue eyes? Why wasn't I certain? I could not see her mouth very well, but her cheeks were like pink roses. Weren't they Rowena's cheeks? But wasn't she taller than before? I was filled with a kind of madness. I ran to her, but she moved away. Then I saw her long hair moving in the wind. It was blacker than the black of midnight, and now, slowly, her eyes opened. I shouted like a madman, "These are the black eyes of my lost love, the eyes of Ligeia."
Down into the Maelstrom. I read about the Maelstrom in a book, and I always wanted to see it. The Maelstrom appears in the sea near the coast of Norway. In the northwest of that country there is a region called Nordland. And near the coast of Nordland there is a group of islands called Lofoten. 2 of the Lofoten Islands are called Moskoe and Vurg. Between Moskoe and Vurg there is a narrow place where the sea turns and races in a great circle. This is the Maelstrom, a whirlpool. In the Maelstrom, the sea rises up and then falls. As the sea falls, it turns in a circle. It turns faster and faster. It is the same as water going down into a huge pipe. The Maelstrom is very dangerous for boats and ships. It pulls them down into the sea. Many ships have sunk, and many men have died in the dangerous water. I wanted to see the great whirlpool, so I went to Norway. When I got to Nordland, I found a guide. I paid this man to show me the Maelstrom. He took me to the top of a cliff early one morning. "This is the best time to see the whirlpool," he said. We came to the edge of the cliff and looked down. The sea was more than 1,000 feet below us. I stepped back from the edge quickly. I felt ill and afraid. I wanted to sit down. The wind was blowing very strongly, and the waves of the sea crashed against the rocks below us. I thought that I was going to fall over the edge of the cliff. "We are on the side of a mountain called Helseggen the Cloudy," said my guide. He reached out his hand and pointed across the sea toward a group of islands. "Look, those are the Lofoten. Can you see the 2 smallest islands? They are Moskoe and Vurg. No one lives there. Now listen and look at the sea between the islands." I looked at the 2 smallest islands. They were black rocks. No one could live on them. I listened and heard the sound of the wind. But then I heard another sound. It was a low sound. It sounded like hundreds of huge animals were calling and running together. I could hear the sound and I could feel the sound. I could feel the low sound in my body. "The tide is turning," said my guide. He pointed down to the sea below us. "The tide turns twice each day. Look at the sea. It is turning and moving in another direction." I looked to where the man was pointing. The dark water far below us was as black as oil. I watched it moving slowly. It started to rise and turn, as if it were a pot of hot water on a fire. But the seawater was not hot. It was as cold as ice. The wind blew the tops of the waves. It made many tiny bubbles of air in the water. The tiny bubbles became white foam. Soon, more and more white foam appeared on the Black Sea. My guide pointed toward the islands of Moskoe and Vurg again. "Watch the sea between the islands!" he shouted. Then there was another change in the sea. The water became smoother, but it did not become calmer. The dark water started to move in a huge circle. It moved very quickly. It spun around and around. The edge of the circle was white with foam. It was amazing. Is that the great whirlpool? The Maelstrom? I asked. Yes, said my guide. That is the terrible Maelstrom. When fishermen sail toward this coast, they look for Moscow. They do not come closer than a mile. Do fishermen sail near these islands? I asked. I could not believe this. Yes, they do. I did. I was a fisherman once. There are a great many fish near Moscow. But isn't it too dangerous to fish here? I asked. Fishermen know when the tides rise and fall. There are 2 times in the day when it is safe. We go out when the sea is calm and smooth. Then we come back 12 hours later. And is fishing always safe at those times? Are boats and ships never lost? I asked. Many boats and ships are lost in the Maelstrom, the man said. Fishermen make mistakes and their boats are pulled down. Sometimes larger ships are lost in the Maelstrom when they come too close. The sea is calm one moment and a storm can be blowing 5 minutes later. I looked at the Maelstrom in amazement. I could not believe it. The whirlpool was moving faster and faster. As the whirlpool moved, the water in its center dropped down. There was now a hole or pit in the center of the whirlpool. Nothing can go into that hole and come out alive, I said. It is a huge round mouth in the sea. That mouth will swallow everything that comes near it. It makes me afraid. That is true, said my guide. The Maelstrom swallows ships and whales and men, but one man went into the Maelstrom and came out alive. Surely that is impossible, I said. I looked at the round black mouth in the sea. My body shook with fear. The white foam made me think of teeth, terrible teeth, and the noise of the wind and water. It was the noise of a monster eating rocks. How old do you think that I am? Asked my guide. He shouted these words. I shook my head. It was difficult to hear his voice. The noise of the Maelstrom was now very loud. We moved back from the edge of the cliff. We went and sat behind some rocks. How old do you think that I am? The man asked again. I did not understand the reason for his question. His hair was white and he had many lines on his face. He moved slowly. He must be an old man. Are you more than 60 years old? I asked. No, I am 40, said my guide. The Maelstrom made me old. I'll tell you my story. It happened 3 years ago. This is my guide's story. I am writing his words. One day in the summer, my brothers and I went out in our fishing boat. It was 7 o'clock in the morning of July 10th. The sea was calm and smooth. We sailed past Moscow Island to look for fish. There were many fish in the sea that day. We caught a large number of them and loaded them into our boat. We were very busy and we forgot how many hours had passed. In summer, we have nearly 20 hours of daylight in Norway. The nights are short. There are only 4 hours of darkness. When I looked at my watch, I saw that it was 6 o'clock in the evening. We had to pass Moscow Island at 7 o'clock. That was the time when the tide turned. It was safe at 7 o'clock that day. We were about an hour away from Moscow. We started to return home immediately. A storm came suddenly. Dark clouds covered the sky and the wind started to blow. Our boat raced before the storm. Faster and faster, we sailed toward home and safety. When I looked to the northeast, I saw Moscow Island. The sea was moving very quickly, but it was almost the safe time of the day. It was almost 7 o'clock. I was sure of this. I took my watch out of my pocket again and looked at it. Then I had a terrible shock. My watch still showed 6 o'clock. It had stopped. My brothers were in the front of the boat. I called to them. "The Maelstrom!" I shouted. "My watch was wrong! We are too late!" It was not the safe time of day. It was the time when the great whirlpool opened like a mouth in the sea. We were going to die. Our boat shook. It shook as if it were a dog throwing water off its body. Then the boat suddenly became still. A few seconds later, the tide picked up our boat and started turning it. It pulled us into the circle of white water around the edge of the whirlpool. Our boat moved slowly and steadily around the edge of the whirlpool. It circled many times. Each time that our boat circled, it moved a little closer to the great mouth in the sea. From the edge of the circle, the wall of the pit was as steep as a cliff. I had to look down at it. I could not turn my head away. Around and around we went. My brothers held on to the mast in the center of the boat. We could not speak. The noise of the wind and water was too loud. I could not hold onto the mast. I held onto a wooden barrel. It was our barrel of drinking water. The barrel was almost empty. Our boat moved faster and faster. Now the clouds had disappeared from the sky and we saw the moon. I thought that we had been in the whirlpool for many hours. The hours of darkness are between 2 and 7 o'clock in the morning. Could we live a little longer? The safe time of the day was 7 o'clock. Could we live for 3 or maybe 4 hours more? The answer was no. The moon showed us the black mouth in the sea. We were going to fall into that mouth. But we did not fall. The boat did not fall suddenly from the wall of water. We moved down smoothly and steadily. I had time to think about death, my death. I thought about the water going into my mouth and lungs. I was going to drown. Was the sea going to take our bodies and keep them? Or was it going to throw our bodies back onto the land? I looked down into the black pit. Our boat was on the side of the wall of water. The wall of water was turning faster and faster. I looked straight down the pipe of water, but I did not fall. We were moving so quickly in a circle that we did not fall. I was amazed. The air raced past me. I was on the edge of death, but I was alive. It was strange. I was excited. But the fear of death fell on my brothers. They took a rope and tied themselves to the mast in the center of the boat. I also took a piece of rope. I tied the rope around my body and onto the barrel. Where was the bottom of the sea? It could not be far. And I knew that there were sharp rocks at the bottom of the sea. We were going to be cut and broken on the rocks. Our boat moved lower and lower down the black pipe. Then the boat moved to the left and the right. It shook. I was thrown into the black water of the pit. But I did not sink beneath the water because I was tied to the barrel. The barrel stayed on the top of the water. I saw the boat and my brothers fall down into the pit. We were turning around in the whirlpool. Then the boat disappeared and I started to rise. The barrel moved up slowly and it took me with it. Then, suddenly, I was no longer in danger. One moment, I was on the wall of water. The next moment, I was on the top of flat, smooth water. The sea had changed. It was calm. The whirlpool had disappeared. I was no longer looking down. I was looking up. I was looking up at the sky. It was dawn and the sun was shining. Sunlight shone from behind the mountain, Helseggen the cloudy. Fishermen were sailing their boats toward me. They pulled me from the water. No one believed my story. My brothers never returned. Our boat never returned. And my friends and family did not know me. I now looked 20 years older. My black hair had become white. Fear had made lines on my face.